This is Philosophy 6, Introduction to Logic at Las Positas College, and this is an introduction to section 3.2, Fallacies of Relevance. So in section 3.2, Hurley introduces us to one subsection of fallacies that we're going to be learning. And section 3.2 is all about fallacies of relevance. Fallacies of relevance share the common characteristic that the arguments in which they occur have premises that are logically not relevant to the conclusion. They may appear to be, and they may be psychologically relevant, but they do not offer good evidence for the conclusion that follows. The first example that Hurley gives is the appeal to force. An appeal to force is made whenever someone attempts to force you to believe a conclusion just by offering a threat if you refuse to believe the conclusion. Of course, a threat is not good evidence that any conclusion is true, and so for that reason it's a fallacy. Here's a nice example given by Hurley. A child says to his playmate, "Sesame Street is the best show on TV. If you don't believe it," and then here comes the threat, "I'm going to call my big brother and he is going to beat you up." So this is obviously not a good argument. We do have a conclusion. The conclusion is that Sesame Street is the best show on TV. And the speaker did also give a premise meant to support that conclusion. If you don't believe it, my brother will beat you up. But the fact that his brother might beat me up is no kind of true evidence that the claim is true. It might give me some reason to try to believe or to want to believe that the claim is true, but it's not actually evidence that the claim is true. Next we have the appeal to pity. The appeal to pity is a fallacy that occurs when an arguer attempts to support a conclusion by merely evoking pity from the reader or listener, rather than giving evidence that some claim is in fact true. And Hurley gives us an example here. We have a taxpayer to a judge. "Your Honor," says the taxpayer, "I admit that I did it, but my reputation will be ruined, ... if you find me guilty. Surely you will agree that I'm not guilty." So "I'm not guilty" is the conclusion, and all this stuff about the negative consequences to the taxpayer is the premise. Now, if the taxpayer was arguing, "all these bad things will happen to me, therefore you should show me leniency," that may not be a fallacy, because in that case, the taxpayer is arguing from a claim about pity to leniency. But if the claim is something about truth, which it is here, right? The taxpayer is arguing that I am in fact not guilty. Negative consequences that will come out of a certain truth claim are no evidence that that truth claim is true or that it's false, at least under most circumstances. Appeals to the people have this in common, that they appeal to our desire to be loved, admired, esteemed, valued, recognized by others, and uses that as a premise to get us to believe some conclusion. Now Hurley separates these appeals to the people as direct and indirect approaches. With a direct approach, there's just a direct appeal to things like the camaraderie, euphoria, and excitement of something like a political convention. And Hurley gives that as an example. The euphoria, the excitement, the enthusiastic participants don't really give any good evidence that the platform or claims of the political party are true, but it can be very persuasive on us as listeners. Hurley includes in the direct appeals ad populum the appeal to fear. In some ways, it's sort of a strange place to put the appeal to fear, because appeals to fear are not always appeals to a group as a whole, which the fallacy of ad populum also implies. An appeal to fear can be a direct appeal of one person to the fears of another, but certainly Hurley's correct to say that oftentimes in a situation like a political platform or a large group, things like threats and fear are oftentimes used to persuade people, aside from any good, solid evidence that that fear would come to fruition. Hurley gives examples of political cases where wild speculation about unfounded fears is used, and the emotional force of the fear itself takes the place of a rational argument for why a certain claim is likely to be true. Keep in mind that for Hurley, the appeal to fear is largely one of these ad populum arguments, so when you're looking to identify it in the homework, you want to look for these situations where the appeal to fear is made on a broad scale instead of just between two individuals. An appeal to the people can also be indirect, and Hurley considers an appeal to the people to be indirect just in case it's not the crowd as a whole that's being appealed to, but it's just one or more individuals separately within that crowd, and it's their relationship to the crowd that's being emphasized. So appealing to individuals within the crowd or a group of individuals to say, this is how you relate to the community as a whole or to the group as a whole, that is what Hurley considers to be an indirect approach. One example of this is the bandwagon argument. The bandwagon argument proceeds by someone saying, well, everyone else, that's the rest of the crowd, right, believes such and such. Don't you think that you ought to believe such and such as well? He gives a few examples here. Everyone nowadays is on a low-carb diet, right? This is the group as a whole. You, as a member of the group, don't you think you should accept the low-carb diet as the best way to go as well? Come on, everybody just about believes in life after death. Therefore, don't you think that you should believe in life after death as well? The premise is just the claim that everyone else is in the group. The conclusion that you're supposed to endorse is that because everyone else believes it's true, it must be true. Of course, this is kind of a strange fallacy in some ways because the fact that everyone believes something actually probably is, in many cases, some evidence that the claim is likely to be true. But the biggest problem here is that the speaker is substituting actual evidence that might show why the claim is true with a general conclusion that, well, everyone already believes it. Hurley also differentiates from these forms another indirect form, which he calls the appeal to vanity. The appeal to vanity is not entirely unlike some of the other ad populum appeals. It's another indirect approach for Hurley. But the key idea here is that we're thinking that we can get love and admiration or approval in a very specific way. And that is some famous figure who is loved, admired, and approved of is used to support the claim that the speaker is trying to get us to believe. Maybe I would like to be as fashionable and cool as Ellen DeGeneres, or as dashing as Daniel Craig. So if we can point out that these famous, lovable, wonderful people are associated with these products or these beliefs, then maybe it gives me some reason as well for wanting to take on these beliefs. In the case of appeal to snobbery, we again have an appeal to a smaller group that's supposed to be superior in some way to the group as a whole. If the listener wants to be a part of this small elite group, then they are asked to take on the beliefs or actions of that elite group. The Lexus 400 series is not for everyone. If you want to be a part of this small elite group that owns the Lexus 400, then you ought to agree it's the best and most desirable of automobiles. Hurley also includes the appeal to tradition as an indirect appeal ad populum. An appeal to tradition is made whenever someone argues that, well, you ought to believe that something is true because this is the way it's always been done. We've always believed that this is true, and it's a tradition. So Hurley includes this as a form of indirect appeal ad populum because he reduces it to the claim that it's what everyone thinks, therefore we should do it as well, just in the guise of a tradition, rather than just saying, well, everyone believes it. He gives a few examples. Here's that word. Traditionally, keep an eye out for that word, professional sporting events have been preceded by the national anthem. Therefore, here's the conclusion, sporting events should continue to be preceded by the national anthem. But once again, the premise is not explaining why the conclusion is true. It's just saying, well, it's a tradition. We should keep doing what we've always done. The argument ad hominem, or the argument against the person, is a kind of argument that always involves, at least Hurley will say, two arguers. Someone is making an argument already, and then someone else, rather than responding to that argument with a logical response, tries to dismiss the argument by attacking the person themselves rather than attacking the argument. Hurley talks about three forms of ad hominem. The first one is ad hominem abusive. An ad hominem abusive is just when some person verbally abuses another person rather than responding to their argument. Bill Maher argues that religion is a lot of foolish nonsense. That's person one, right? Bill Maher. Person two, who's our speaker, says, Maher himself is just arrogant, shameless, and self-righteous, so whatever he says must be wrong. Now, regardless of how you feel about Bill Maher, if he is an arrogant, shameless, and self-righteous pig, that doesn't actually make the claims that he is making necessarily less true. It might just make him a bad kind of person who you don't want to spend time around. Hurley includes the, quote, love it or leave it fallacy as part of the ad hominem abusive. I guess it works okay. I'm not totally convinced, but you might want to have that in mind in case Hurley uses it again. The idea that someone makes a claim and you just abuse them by saying, well, get out of here if you don't accept what I believe. The next kind of ad hominem argument that Hurley discusses is the ad hominem circumstantial. In the ad hominem circumstantial, what happens is that someone makes an argument, and rather than responding to the evidence given in the argument, the second person just says, well, of course you would say that, because who you are as a person, the circumstances you're in, means you have something to gain or something to lose by the truth or falsity of that claim. Here's an example given by Hurley. The Dalai Lama argues that China has no business in Tibet, but of course the Dalai Lama would say that was true because he was the former leader of Tibet. So in this case, rather than responding to whatever argument the Dalai Lama made for the claim that China should not be in Tibet, the second person, the speaker in this case, just said, well, whatever argument the Dalai Lama made, I'm not going to accept it as legitimate because he must just be arguing for it because he has something to gain by his argument being true. Now, in fact, this might be some reason to be suspicious of the argument, but it's actually no evidence in itself that the claim that the speaker made is false. Tu quoque is the last of these arguments ad hominem that Hurley is going to cover. You can think of it as the U2 fallacy, and that's just what tu quoque is actually saying. When someone commits a fallacy of tu quoque, again we have two speakers. One person either implicitly or already has made an argument, and the second person dismisses that argument because of some fact about the speaker. In this case, the argument is always, you have no right to tell me what to do because you do it too. Imagine that your doctor said, you really shouldn't be smoking. Smoking is bad for you. And then you found your doctor outside the hospital smoking right after he gave you that lecture. You might want to say, well, why should I listen to the doctor? He smokes too, so he's no person to tell me that I shouldn't be smoking. But realistically, the fact that the doctor is herself smoking is not itself evidence that what the doctor said is false. It just proves at the most that the doctor is a hypocrite. But if you want to prove that smoking is good for you, you'd actually have to get evidence based on studies, and the mere fact that the person speaking to you is a hypocrite is no evidence that their claim is false. Again, the idea is that you have to address the evidence for the claim rather than dismissing the claim because of some fact about the person who said it. In the case of tu quoque, the fact is just, well, your actions are going against the very thing that you told me is true or untrue. It may make you a hypocrite, but it doesn't make you wrong in your claim. Next, the fallacy of accident is committed when a general rule is applied to a specific case it was not intended to cover. Typically, the general rule is cited, either directly or implicitly, in the premises and then wrongly applied to the specific case. An example given by Hurley is freedom of speech. It's true it is a constitutionally guaranteed right, but in a case where someone used that freedom of speech to incite a riot, that speech is not constitutionally protected. The Constitution explicitly doesn't apply the right of free speech to cases like inciting riots. So the general rule is being used in a way that anyone who understands what the rule actually is will understand that the rule doesn't apply. The straw man fallacy is another fallacy that involves two speakers. In this case, you have one speaker who makes an argument, and a second speaker takes the argument made by the first speaker and makes it into a bad argument by misrepresenting it so that they can defeat that argument. That's the reason it's called the straw man argument, because the original argument made by a real person is replaced with a pretend argument. Ignoratio Elenchi is the fallacy of missing the point. And the way Hurley differentiates this from other fallacies is to say that the fallacy occurs when evidence is given, and the evidence does support some conclusion. It just doesn't support the conclusion that was actually given by the arguer. It supports some other conclusion instead. And Hurley gives a couple of examples. Crimes of theft and robbery have been increasing at an alarming rate lately. The conclusion is obvious. We must reinstate the death penalty immediately. Now, if crimes are in fact increasing in a neighborhood, that's an important thing to know, and it probably is a premise for some conclusion. But it's probably not a good premise to support the conclusion that the death penalty should be reinstated. For one thing, there don't exist any states where theft and robbery on their own are capital offenses. So there's no real connection between the death penalty and theft and robbery. At least if there is, that argument would have to be made separately. The last fallacy that Hurley will cover in section 3.2 is the red herring. The red herring is a fallacy that's committed when the arguer diverts the attention of the reader or listener by changing the subject to a different but sometimes subtly related argument. This comes from classic examples of sport hunting, where a red herring, because of its strong scent, was pulled across the path of the dogs to try to get the dogs off of the scent of the actual prey that they were pursuing. So a red herring is something that engages you with a desire to focus on it, even though by focusing on it, you've actually lost track of what you were actually trying to talk about in the first place. Here's one of Hurley's examples. There's a good deal of talk these days about the need to eliminate pesticides from our fruits and vegetables. But, and here comes the red herring, dragged across our path to distract us from the actual argument, many of these foods are essential to our health. Here's some more irrelevant information. Carrots are an excellent source of vitamin A, broccoli is rich in iron, and oranges and grapefruit have lots of vitamin C. All of these are true as far as I know, but not really relevant to whether or not we should have pesticides used on our fruits and vegetables. So we've changed the subject from talking about pesticides specifically to generalized questions about whether or not we should be eating fruits and vegetables. If I get pulled into that secondary discussion, I may lose track entirely of what the original argument was about, and so I might start agreeing with the secondary argument, even though it's not really relevant to what was being argued in the first place. So hopefully this quick introduction will help you as you make your way through the reading. Don't forget to do the Learning Logic tutorials as well. Those will help prepare you for the assignments that follow.